All right, hello everyone. Trying a slightly different technique for getting this recorded and transcribed today. So hopefully some of the tech issues will be better. Thank you to the folks who let me know there were challenges last time. I'm really excited for this week's readings. They're readings that matter to me a lot. I like both of them as pieces of writing, which matters a lot to me. And also, I think the question of research ethics is really fundamental to what all of us are doing as researchers. So my goal for today is for me to kind of give you a bit of a background, and kind of some of what I'm going to be doing is dumping information on you. And I'm not going to be talking much about the readings today because you guys will be able to talk about the readings with me in class. And I think both Carpenter and Wilson are bringing a lot to the table. And I don't want to cut off any of your idea development reaction to them. So I'm not going to talk much about them, except that they come up as I talk about the concepts. But really what I'm going to give you is this kind of big picture of research ethics as a field and why it matters at all, and why it in particularly matters for us in this class and for how we approach talking about research. So let's get it started. Okay, so we're going to talk about it across the paradigms, and you might be like, ugh, she's coming back to the paradigms again. Well, I'm coming back to the idea of paradigms because I find that if you don't think about how paradigms influence how we work at this juncture, it's hard to present a kind of a narrative of what research ethics is that hits all the bases, right? Because as I'm going to talk about, right, and as I think shows up in both Carpenter's piece and Wilson's piece, the approach you have to research ethics is super dependent on where you come from. But we all do live in the same world that has some of the same restrictions on it. So this big question, what is research ethics? And the answer is fundamentally, right, what does it sound like research ethics is? It's how to conduct research ethically, right? Like, this is not rocket science, right? But what it is, we can talk generally about how to behave ethically as a researcher, right? And that's got a lot of complex pieces. It matters how you cite your sources and how you treat the people you're working with and what you think is right to study and not to study, right? All of those are big questions of research ethics, of ethical research writ large. But then tied to that is this concept of there are formal regulations that researchers have to follow. And if you don't follow those regulations, you can get in trouble. And they're all grounded in some very solid ethical principles, but they're also kind of grounded in some particular worries that are historical products of where they are, right? So for everybody who enjoyed me talking about disciplinary history, you're about to get another dose of that today. So today, what we're going to be talking about is a little bit of how ethical commitments are tied to paradigms. We're going to introduce a new paradigm that we're not going to follow through the whole class, but that's going to make repeat appearances, which is an indigenous or indigenist paradigm, depending on how you talk about it. And then we're going to talk about how research ethics is governed in Canada. So, what does positivism think about research ethics, right? Now, you might think positivism, with its obsession with objectivity and the kind of neutral fact-finding nature of it, might not have anything to say about research ethics. But in fact, it was positivists who developed the regime of research ethics we have today. And the reason is because no matter, even if you're only dealing in empirical questions and the normative aspect of them is separate, right? This kind of point that normative questions are secondary to empirical questions, the rules of research ethics arose out of a set of moments where undeniable harm was done to research participants. And we'll talk about that a little later, right? And so positivist researchers said, I don't want to commit harm, right? How do I avoid committing harm? And in their action of trying to avoid committing harm, they came up with rules. And they said, if you follow these rules, you're good, right? So what you have to do is follow the rules properly. That's your job. And kind of the normative commitment that comes with a positivist research ethics, right, is that our job is to present true facts, right? We may care about what the outcome of those facts are, what the consequences of those facts are, but if we're presenting true facts, right, and we're accurately representing our work, we're behaving ethically. So it's unethical in a positivist point of view to do something that's referred to as p-hacking, right? Which is essentially, we can talk about this later if it's interesting to anybody, right? But essentially to manipulate your statistical data to get a result that looks more important than it is, right? Because that's not presenting true facts. But the content of what you're researching, or whether, you know, is less important to that, right? So that kind of question of, you know, if we have normative desires, they need to be separate from the content of what they need to be kind of separate from the truth of what we're researching, right? And this was a challenge to many positivist researchers when scandals come out of people falsifying data, right? Because it's such a gross violation of their ethical principles, right, as researchers. And frankly, despite not being a person who follows that kind of research trajectory, I also find it a violation of research principles, right? It's a violation of different sort of epistemic logic for me, but it's a violation, right? For realism, right, realism is very concerned with context dependence when it comes to research ethics, right? And they believe that there may be ethical duties as well as ethical responsibilities, right? I would say that we're going to talk, you know, I'm not going to give too much time to realism because I think realism agrees with a lot of interpretivist points on this, right? And again, this has to do with the fact that epistemologically, there's a lot of agreement between realists and interpretivists, and also axiologically, there's a lot of agreement, right? In that people have similar axioms and choose to implement them in similar ways. Right? But this kind of realism, remember, it has this interest in power, right? It has this interest in structures, right? And so if you've got an interest in structures, you have to think ethically about how you're positioned within them, right? What are your own structures? So it's a little bit of reflexivity that is required there. And so for interpretivists, right, there's a focus on subjectivity, right, which is to say that the positions of the researched, right, those people being involved in the research, are important and should be respected and validated, right? They're not abstract quantities. They have a kind of meaning, and, you know, doing wrong by them is harmful to them, right? And that's a type of harm. And so a situation where you are, you know, collecting true data, but presenting it would, you know, would cause a gap between like different people, right? That needs to be thought about. Interpretivism is power sensitive, right? And this is something that I think it shares substantially with realism here. This idea that these relationships between researcher and the researched has to take into account power differentials, right? Frequently, in many cases, their researchers hold structural power over those being researched. There are other cases where, for instance, you're researching up is the terminology that's used. You're researching, say, important government officials or something like that. And in that case, you need to think about that process, what openness means, and what it means for you to treat people who have more power than you ethically. That's a question. And then interpretivism also is really interested in reflexivity, right? Which means being able to look at and reflect on your position and your duties, right? So this concept of having ethical duties is important in interpretivism, just as it is in realism. So kind of these approaches are grounded in being able to say, like, who am I as the researcher, and what do I do, and who are my obligations to, right? I have a set of obligations. I have a set of duties. For the positivist, those duties are to the field, you might say, right? To proper science. And if you don't fulfill those, you're not behaving ethically. And you also have a generalized duty to not do harm, right? I was working on a project involving a very positivist textbook that was very good quality, except so positivist, and also $100. That's why I didn't assign it to you. And it presented like this core idea that the fundamental point of research ethics is do no harm. And I think a lot of interpretivists would agree, do no harm, but they'd also agree, do some good, right? Well, that requires knowing what good is. And I think a lot of positivists would be like, I'm not prepared to be certain about what good is. I think interpretivists are a little more comfortable making a call on that one somehow, right? Or at least recognizing that they can pick an option there. Though I'm certain some have a different attitude towards it. But the one thing I really want to point out is that the three paradigms that we're going to be talking about in this class come from the Western positions, right? These are concepts that come from forms of Euro-Mediterranean philosophy, right? And that have gained their particular interpretation in North American academic traditions, and to a lesser extent, European academic traditions. But there's a different conversation about research ethics in Europe, and much less codification of it, though there's more coming now with the EU. And this is fundamental. The discipline of political science is not a discipline that emerges equally from all parts in the world, because many parts of the world and many people in the world were put in forced subject positions of being colonized and having indigenous intellectual traditions, and here I mean indigenous in kind of the small I generic sense of local in many different places, wiped out, right? And so to the extent to which local traditions of knowledge gathering and knowledge production have been obliterated through Western imperialism, right? We end up stuck with the paradigms we have are those that come from Western philosophy, right? And that's a loss for all of us. Right? And in our particular Canadian settler colonial context, part of our conversation about research ethics has been a conversation about dealing with the fact that research has not behaved ethically towards First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities in Canada. And so that the Indigenous communities of Canada, and there's a parallel history in the US for Indigenous communities located in what's now the US, have borne the burden of some forms of ethical malpractice. And one way that Indigenous researchers, not just on Turtle Island, but elsewhere in the world, there's wonderful stuff coming out of Aotearoa and Australia, and also elsewhere in the world, right? There's a whole different literature coming out of India and different material coming out of Latin America, right? But what's happening in all of that literature, right, is what do Indigenous ways of knowing look like? And how do they produce different forms of knowledge? And so what kinds of paradigms of research come out of Indigenous ways of knowing? And so for people who want to work in those traditions, right, the intellectual and the philosophical roots are different. They're just fundamentally different, right? The things that we think of as universal are in fact culturally specific to Euro-Mediterranean traditions, right? And I say Euro-Mediterranean because if you know anything about the history of Western philosophy, you know that for a long time its center was Baghdad because and Alexandria, right? Which is to say it circled the Mediterranean and then came back, and then colonialism. And anyway, this is not my history of the Mediterranean and how power relations work across it. But anyway, so we kind of have this different tradition, right? And so you'll notice I'm saying indigenous and indigenist. I'm borrowing this terminology from Wilson, but not necessarily, not the book you read, right? You guys read a chapter or two from his book, Research is Ceremony. And in some of his later talks, he moves from talking about an indigenous paradigm of research to an indigenist paradigm of research. And the reason he does that, and he says in his talks, is that calling it an indigenous paradigm of research says that only indigenous people can use it, right? An indigenous practice is a practice for indigenous people. Okay? Whereas an indigenist paradigm is a paradigm that draws from indigenous ways of knowing and ways of being and works from them, but can be exercised by anybody. So the kind of the metaphor I've heard him use is that anyone can use a feminist research paradigm. And similarly, anyone can use an indigenous research paradigm. It's that a feminist research paradigm is attentive to gender and is rooted, you know, a more essentialist feminist than me would say something about rooted in women's different forms of knowing. The kind of feminist I am would say is rooted in a structural understanding of the role of gender in structuring society, right? And an indigenist is rooted in indigenous ways of understanding epistemology, right? It's an epistemological and an ontological difference. And if you work from that position, you're going to produce indigenist work. So that's what's going on with those two terms. And so what we get in Wilson's approach, right? And what I love about this is first of all, I'm just kind of like, oh, you use terms that are also the terms I use and you're doing different things with them. I love it, right? I recognized this book when I read it. I'm like, yes, right. And so he's really interested in this relationship between ontology, epistemology, methodology, and axiology, right? That's what interests him. What's the theory of being? What's the theory of knowing? What are the principles that guide your work? And what are the ways in which you connect to the way you carry out the work, right? And the point he comes up with, and the book is actually really great to read in only like 120 pages. So if you get into this, buy this book, it's awesome. What he gets into is that ontology, epistemology, methodology, and axiology are a circle, right? And they all feed into each other, and that they're organized around the idea of relationships, right? And so the ontology and epistemology are characterized through relation, which is to say that objects are defined and understood through their relationships to others, right? And those can be social structures, those can be people, they can be communities, right? So kind of the idea is that it is through how things are relationally positioned to each other that you come to understand them, right? And so this is, they not just can be described in that way, right? But that both they are constituted in that way through relationship, right? I think he uses, I do not remember if this is in part of the book you read or another part of the book you read. He uses the kind of concept that there's no way in Cree to say grandmother, you say my grandmother or your grandmother, right? That is constructed. Similarly, you could think about the fact that nobody is a parent without also having a child, right? And so like that relationship only exists insofar as the two social roles of parent and child are defined through a relationship with each other, right? Well, similarly, nobody is a subject if there is not a state, right? That would be a relational way to think about, or nobody is a citizen without there being a state, right? If there isn't the concept of state, then you can't have the concept of citizen, right? And so membership in a political community is defined by the nature of that relationship between how the community is constituted and thinks of itself and relates to its citizens and how the citizens relate to it, right? Or the members, if you want to give it a more neutral term, right? So this is what it means to think relationally about ontology and epistemology, right? And secondly, the methodology and axiology are defined by relational accountability. The point here is that maintaining a right ethical state between researcher, research participant, and the broader community is the most important component of the research. And the point is right relationship, right? This is a normative point of view. Some relationships are healthy and some relationships are unhealthy, right? And an unhealthy relationship does not support good research. It doesn't matter how good your ontology and epistemology are, right? The unhealthiness of that relationship poisons the research. And this can be challenging, right? Because you have a lot of relationships to negotiate in any research projects, right? And thinking about what it means to be accountable to other people and who you are accountable to and how to behave towards them, right? This is an ethically challenging stance, mainly in the sense that it's really substantive, right? And if you compare it to the type of ethics that exists in a positivist framework, right? Well, that one's follow a set of rules and you did okay, right? This one is, what is the extent to which you can account for all your relationships? And that's a complicated one, right? So I think about relational accountability a lot. I think about it, the intellectual tradition I come from is one where some of this is contained within something about reflexivity, right? That's because that's my Western heritage philosophical way to think about it, right? And I think the fact that this is in dialogue with an Indigenous one is good, right? And we can come from different places and get to the same ethical principles in the end. It's really hard, right? So what's worth saying, I'm realizing I didn't put a slide on Indigenous research ethics as they are institutionalized in positivist institutions in Canada. What you will see if you start looking into, say, what TCPS has to say about Indigenous research, or what Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada says about research with Indigenous communities. Essentially, the way positivists have interpreted this is that they've said, okay, Indigenous communities say, these are the rules we have to follow when we interact with them. And if we interact with them according to these rules, we will have done it right. All right, that's the position. In some ways, like, the result may be very similar, right? But you can recognize that that's different than saying what you need is to maintain a proper reciprocal ethical relationship, right? That is grounded in being accountable to each other. That being said, it actually represents there are real differences in how to carry out research with Indigenous communities according to the rules, and how to carry out research with other marginalized communities or other non-marginalized communities in the rules as they stand, right? And I think that's good, right? First of all, because the whole purpose of these rules is to stop people doing the things they've done before that were bad, right? And they do represent an articulation of Indigenous claims to more ethical research and a demand to be treated as partners in the research process. I kind of wish the rules around Indigenous research were the rules for engaging with any community in a research process, because I think you should always have to be culturally sensitive, and you should always have to seek local approval, and you should always, like, whatever. I kind of think that stuff should be universal, right? But we can talk more about kind of how this works, and I'm going to try to remember to bring to class some stuff on working with Indigenous communities, because I think it's a little kind of where paradigms collide moment. There are a lot of where paradigms collide moments in research ethics all the time, right? So kind of transitioning from paradigms, let's talk a little bit about regulation, right? Because this is really how researchers come to know this problem, right? Which is to say that we've developed over the course of the 20th century, and they're now very strongly put in place now in the 21st, institutional responses to basically gross failures of ethical behavior, right? We are talking about the research conducted in Nazi concentration camps on Jewish and other victims of the Holocaust, right? We are talking about the Tuskegee experiment, where Black men were allowed to die from syphilis so they could track the natural progression of the disease. We're talking about the entire development of Western obstetrics and gynecology, which involved surgery being conducted on Black women while conscious, right? We're talking about the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill in the 60s, where the Canadian government and the CIA funded research on people with schizophrenia and other serious mental illnesses who wanted to receive treatment and instead were experimented on with hallucinogenic drugs and brainwashing techniques to see if we could brainwash people out of being mentally ill. Which, you know, people were harmed, people were killed by medical experimentation. People were given lasting psychological harm by psychological experimentation, right? And we learned from these experiments, right? But at the same time, one of the things we learned is that the gathering of knowledge cannot be conducted in a vacuum, right? So if you get this strong do no harm principle at the core of the regulation of research ethics, it's because harm has been done, right? And I don't ever want to kind of give an innocent idea of what research ethics is about, right? For all that, you're going to hear some of my skepticism about some of these rules and the way they're articulated, because I come from a different paradigmatic place than the rules, right? The rules are there because people messed up, right? They hurt people. And so we have rules in place to try to A, prevent gross failures of research ethics, and B, try to put systems in place to prevent the little ones too, right? Really to like, get that trajectory. And so what we have here in Canada is called TCPS 2. TCPS 2 is the Tri-Council Policy Statement on Research Ethics. Carpenter writes in her article about an IRB, an Institutional Review Board, which is what they're called in the US. In Canada, they're called Research Ethics Boards. And that was a vocabulary shift I had to learn when I moved here. And REBs, basically, they function at Canadian colleges and universities, and they're conducted in line. Basically, their job is to implement TCPS. The reason TCPS has any kind of force is because if you want to conduct research funded by government funding or by other research institute funding in Canada, it has to be TCPS compliant. And if a university allows research to be conducted which violates these rules and leads to harm, then the university can lose its ability to administer funds that come from the government. And you know, the university does not want to lose those funds. The university wants those funds, right? Every university does. And so basically, this is a good way in which the government is using a very big stick to say, good, do this thing, follow these rules, and you'll minimize the harm you'll do. And if you don't, you can't conduct research with our money, right? And again, kind of for all my snarky bitterness, I actually really like the TCPS guidelines in terms of what they are as principles, right? The principles embedded in TCPS 2 are good. Because what they say is, you know, the guidelines in this policy are based on 3 core principles, which is respect for persons, concern for welfare, and justice. These principles are complementary and interdependent. And it's like, this is an excellent floor. You have to respect the people you're researching. You have to be worried about their well-being, and you have to be concerned about behaving justly. I love it, right? And in fact, my colleagues who are also critical of IRBs and REBs as a general entity are like, yeah, actually TCPS 2 is much better than some of the alternatives internationally, because it really is trying to get at like fundamental ethical principles, right? And then ethical principles get translated into bureaucracy and challenges arise, right? So the most important thing that you guys need to work on understanding is what requires ethics review. It's research involving living human participants or human biological materials, right? Basically, if you are going to be interacting with alive people or with stuff that came from people biologically, right? Like books are cool, like people's papers in an archive are cool, right? Human beings and their bodies, ethical approval is required. Now, there are some exceptions, right? If you rely only on publicly available information where that information is legally accessible to the public and appropriately protected by the law, or publicly accessible and there is no reasonable expectation of privacy, you don't need ethics review. This might be the argument, say, if you wanted to study social media data, or if you wanted to study the contents of Reddit boards, right? In fact, some of the most interesting reasonable expectation of privacy decisions comes about like what that people post on the internet they be said to have a reasonable expectation of privacy of. And it basically comes down to if it's locked in some way, if you need a password or you need permission to access it, it's not, you don't have a reason, people have a reasonable expectation of privacy, right? So for instance, this lecture, because it is not legally accessible to everybody in the form I'm giving it right now, right? I have an expectation of privacy over it. Should I take this and post it to YouTube not locked and make it publicly available, which I do with a lot of my teaching videos, then I no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So if somebody wants to, like, I don't know, study my disgusting basement, they're fine. That's fine. They can do that. All right, this is the more interesting one. RAB review is not required for research involving the observation of people in public places where it does not involve any intervention staged by the researcher or direct interaction with the individuals or groups. Individuals or groups targeted for observation have no reasonable expectation of privacy, and any dissemination of research results does not allow identification of specific individuals. Basically, if you don't interact, you can observe all you want. So this would be the, I'm sitting on a bench. Let's go back to the before times when we could go places, right? I'm waiting, and this is actually, I'm realizing I'm about to say something that is the real before times because it's pre-train. Imagine, I'm remembering taking the bus from Mackenzie King Bridge in the before times, right? Imagine if I sat at that bus stop for 6 hours and took notes on what happened there, right? I might learn things, right? Or it's, I'm waiting, I sit at the same O train station for 6 hours and I take notes. As long as I don't interact with anybody, as long as nobody is identifiable from my notes. And you can't say that people have a reasonable expectation of privacy at a bus station, right? Then I can use that material, right? The minute I talk to somebody, that disappears, right? And so if someone comes up to me and asks me for the time, anything that follows from that interaction is off limits, right? So like somebody comes over and asks me for the time and I strike up a conversation and I learn something relevant to my research question from them, too bad, right? Now I needed to have gotten ethics permission to do the thing, right? That's the division, right? Similarly, if I walk up to somebody and say at a protest and say, hey, what's going on here? And they tell me, then I needed to have permission if I want to use that as data, right? That's the difference. I hope that makes sense. We can talk about it more in class. Okay, so I want to go through, this is some of what the Research Ethics Board form at the University of Ottawa looks like. Many of you are going to end up filling this out for your final project in the class, right? So you get questions like this: who is being recruited? And I want to get you to get the idea, if you look at these, you see things about trust, right? You see things about power. You see things about what's the extent to which people are going to be interfered with or bothered, right? That's what you get, really. And the other thing is, the RAB wants to make sure you're not like fishing wildly, right? They want to make sure you have some kind of sense of what you're doing. And so you need to make sure that, there's a relationship between the question you're asking and what you're actually going to be doing. They're going to want to know what people are going to be asked to do, right? You can see the kind of biological and psychological sciences approach with, will scientific equipment involving direct or indirect physical contact be used, or invasive procedures, right? You get these questions about risk, right? And I want to kind of, risk of physical harm, physical discomfort, risk of psychological or emotional harm, psychological or emotional discomfort, legal repercussions, social repercussions, economic inconveniences, other inconveniences, right? If you say yes to anything, you have to explain what the risks are, and you have to explain how you're going to mitigate them. I will tell you what I tell every student of mine filling one of these out, which is to say, if you say there is no risk of harm, they're going to come back to you and say you're wrong, right? Because at minimum, people are inconvenienced by taking the 20 minutes to do it, right? Like simplest possible thing, right? And so the other thing I always tell them is don't overestimate risk, right? Think really about whether we're talking about risk of harm or whether we're talking about risk of discomfort, right? Which is to say that, you know, there's a difference, right? I do some research in contexts where harm is actually possible. And but in the most cases, what I'm worried about with my participants is discomfort, right? And making sure that I'm working in a way that mitigates discomfort. In other cases, I'm working with people who have the potential to be harmed by what they're doing. But it's a different kind of harm than occurs if, you know, I were working in a medical lab and I were doing surgery on people. Right? There's a lot of concern about privacy. I'm going to put this slide up. I'm going to put the whole PowerPoint on Brightspace so you can see it. But there's a lot of concern about privacy, what privacy means and how people's privacy will be protected. This is because people being able to choose what information is private is central. Canadian policy around privacy is much more intense than the US in general, but not when it comes to research. The same principles of privacy and confidentiality exist in both countries. The distinction between confidentiality and privacy is what can people control that they can express to you, and confidentiality is what you disclose. Right? So for instance, if I am emailing with someone to set up a time to conduct an interview, I have collected personally identifiable information about them. That personally identifiable information about them must be kept confidential, right? Unless they waive their right to confidentiality. So when I conduct the research I conduct for my research group, Community Mobilization in Crisis, we ask people, how do you want to be identified? And the answer is you can be anonymous. You can be identified by a short form of your name or a pseudonym, or you can be identified by your full name. And since most of the people we're talking to are speaking about work they're doing that they're proud of, that they do publicly, they say, I want my proper name, right? And then I'm always very clear, like, what's your proper name? How is it spelled? How is it pronounced? If you're giving it to me in Arabic, how do you want it spelled in English, right? Like I ask all those questions, right? Because it's how people choose to represent themselves. The normal provision in most social science research is for people not to be identified by name, but they're not anonymous. Their identities are confidential because the researcher knows their names, right? So the kind of one of the main characters of my book goes by Suleja in the book, and that is 100% not her name. And the reason she goes by Suleja is we were driving around once after I conducted a formal interview with her. I'm like, oh, you need a pseudonym in my book. What do you want your pseudonym to be? She's like, I've always liked the name Suleja. I'm perfect. That's your name now. And so that's how she's all over my book. Right? You can kind of see how this thing happens. Freedom of informed consent, right? People always have the right to refuse. And people always have to know everything, right? There are some cases in which deception is possible. Some cases, if you tell people everything, you won't actually be able to gather the data you want to collect. This is something that happens in a positivist paradigm. There are rules about that. I didn't include any of them on here, but deception follows a whole different set of rules. Okay, and so just the last slide I have, we'll talk more about kind of what this process looks like. But I want to point out this notion of, you know, what it means to be accountable and relational to people you're working with in a research process, right? Also shows up in dominant paradigms, right? In Eurocentric paradigms of research, which is to say, the reason that the REB asks if there are supervisory or trust-based relationships between persons conducting recruitment and the participants, or between persons obtaining consent and the participants, right, is because there's a recognition that those can be problematic, right? Now, in an indigenous paradigm, right, you need a trust-based relationship between person conducting the research and the participants, right? But that trust-based relationship needs to be conducted ethically. And so in cases where in the dominant paradigm, the goal is to get rid of relationships that have power in them or relationships that are supervisory or trust-based because they might lead to coercion, in an indigenous paradigm, and this is one of those areas where I think the indigenist and some of the kind of critical realist and interpretivist overlap, right? it's to make sure that accountability and that trust is both ways, right? And that people are behaving appropriately towards each other, right? The notion of safeguarding identities of individuals, right? It's a dominant paradigm notion, but what it's got in it is this idea that research participants should get to control their data, right? Like that you should be accountable to them for this. This concept of quotes in their in your words, right? Will they have the opportunity to do it? And I will say that this is not a requirement, but it is something that's kind of in the soft rules and something that I think is a good principle and that more researchers should move towards, which is people being able to approve the way their words are used. So what you can see in this, right, is that this kind of concept of relational accountability and behaving ethically towards persons, it's not absent in dominant Western philosophies of research ethics, right? But it's very different than the way it looks in the indigenous paradigm. So this is definitely, I hope I haven't given you too much to think about with this. I'm really looking forward to our conversations this week. And we can think a little bit about what the ethical requirements of research are and how paradigms intersect with them. And we can use this conversation to get you guys starting to think more about what sort of things interest you about research and what your guiding principles are. Because I think that's, again, this is important to be thinking about what you want to be able to recognize, but you also want to be able to recognize your own. So, and with that, I will leave you with all this wonderful stuff to think about. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all in class.